This is David Mirikitani. Welcome to another episode of Matt Chat, brought to you by USA Wrestling, the national governing body for wrestling in the United States, and by Nike Wrestling. Go to athleteps.com. Happy to be joined today by my good friend Jahi Jones, the treasurer of the Black Wrestling Association and the executive director of the HBCU. Jahi, you and I talk all the time. It'd be fun to do it on the air. How are you, man?
I'm doing well. Yeah, I'm finally happy to be on here. We talk a lot, and so I'm just excited to kind of get to talk to you some more.
We'll probably cover about 90% of it on the air. 10% will stay as friends between us.
Yeah.
So a lot going on, and I know February is Black History Month, but you and I were on a Zoom call with the Black Wrestling Association Sunday. Today is Tuesday when we're recording this. And I think there's a lot of people that don't know exactly what happened with the Morgan State thing. It just pops up, right? Like, hey, now all of a sudden there's wrestling. And so I'm very interested in you telling the story of the how, who was involved, people to thank, and then also what does this mean, both in the short term and the long term, historically. And so I'm going to break it down. I'm just saying, I kind of just want to lay that out for people. Like, I think there's some things that I know how hard you work as a person. We'll probably touch on that, but I just wanted to kind of get into this. So let's start with the genesis of this. How did this get started, and why Morgan State over any other specific HBCU?
Yeah. So, and just to, I think one, that's a great thing to kind of cover, kind of get into like the inner workings of where we're at today. And before, I guess we can just say why Morgan State. I just want to give you a little bit of historical just more context of the organization itself, how we came up. And so it originally, right around the George Floyd situation, a lot of wrestlers, and we kind of started to reflect on what can we do to make sure that our sport that we love so much, it can continue to have opportunities for minority and Black ethnic groups. And so that's when you saw like the emergence of the BWA, the Black Wrestling Association. It was the round talk that they had with USA Wrestling. And then from there, that was the emergence of the Black Wrestling Association. But during that same time, we also realized that, hey, it was a conversation with Kerry McCoy, Nate Parker, Mike Novogratz, that there's over 100 HBCUs in America and not a single one had Division I wrestling. And so what that means is when talented Black wrestlers, they graduate from high school, they kind of have to choose between the sport they love or furthering their understanding of their culture. And that's a hard choice, right? I certainly had to make the choice when I went off to school. And even for me, right, wrestling is a really hard sport to get an opportunity to go to college for, because limited scholarships on a team, right? And so for me, it was a similar approach, and for many other members, stakeholders inside the organization. And so that's what ultimately led to the creation of our organization. So we're currently in the process of trying to fundraise $18 million. Mike Novogratz, who's one of our champions at HBCU Wrestling, has got us more than halfway across the board. He said that it would give us $6 million and $1 million a year of matching opportunities so that we can get it matched to be able to continue to fundraise and be able to provide support to these programs. And so that's where we are, I guess, in terms of the fundraising aspect. But from there, with that fundraising goal in mind, is for us to start 6 schools.
So let me jump in here, because you said some things and I want to go back. So you said a statement, and you and I talk, frankly, I think it's a fair statement. We're friends. And, I'm a minority, but I'm not obviously African-American. And I think we respect each other as people, but we both try to seek understanding, right? At least I know I know you feel that way, but I know I do, is in my role at BWA is to understand, maybe to sympathize, never be able to empathize, right?
Right.
So one of the things you said that struck me in all the conversations we've had, I've never heard the statement, to further understand their culture, your culture, the African-American culture, while being educated. I never thought of it in those terms. Like for me, my father was born in one of the World War II intern camps for the
Right.
Japanese when they were, and that's not in the history books.
Right.
Like I literally had an ex-girlfriend that thought I was lying about that. And I was like, Google it. I'm gonna go to the bathroom, come back. Like, I'm gonna come back and we're gonna have, like, you're gonna apologize because it's not something I'd lie about,
Right.
So I never thought of it that way. And I apologize for my sort of cultural ignorance. I just never thought, I know it's not intentional. I just was like,
Right.
wow, I never thought of it that way. Because, like you can take Black history, you can take, at a traditional school, you can take different classes, African-American studies, things like that. So,
Right. And the other thing that
go ahead.
oh,
I'm gonna ask this, then I'll get out of the way. At an HBCU, are there specific majors and things like that? Are there more classes available? What is the difference?
So there's a lot of difference, right? If you just
Okay.
even go and look at homecoming at an HBCU compared to PWI, predominantly white institution, there's so many differences in just being around your culture. And for some, right, they like, and for some wrestlers, right, they grown up in areas where they're a minority and they're not used to being around, and so they don't really fully understand, right? It's, for some kids they might be the only Black kid in class, right? And for others, right, like for me, I grew up in a predominantly Black area, so going out to a PWI, that was good for me because of the culture change to understand how different things work. So there's never, there's obviously there's benefits with HBCUs, just like there's benefits with going to PWIs. And I think having the ability not to have to choose between either one because you're going to lose the sport of wrestling and the thing that you love, that's what's really important and for us. And then just further, just creating that opportunity to kind of go off to school and be able to go get an education. And then one thing that I could say is, and we talk about it all the time, that me and you, right, as friends, we have a mutual level of respect. And I think with our relationship, if we even look at it, it's like we respect each other because wrestling, right? If someone went through the sport of wrestling, there's a natural respect that you'll have for that person. And so that's kind of what we want to do. We want to build the next generation of leaders and using the vehicle of wrestling to get them there.
Yeah. So on the wrestling respect part, I always tell people that aren't involved in wrestling, I'm like, wrestlers respect the worst wrestler in the world, probably more than 80% of the people in the world that never wrestled.
Yeah.
Especially because the worst guy, and maybe the worst girl now, it's, women's wrestling is coming up, but it hasn't been around as long. But for our conversation, the worst guy probably was one of the toughest people in the room just because he took a bunch of butt kickings for months on end. And so for that person to come in and probably be a very positive person and be gassing people up on the team and probably be sort of like, like the guy pumping up the crowd and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you got to give extra love to somebody that, like, man, this person walked in and knew they were going to get their teeth kicked in every day and came in with the right attitude and made themselves better and made me better. Maybe it's as a wrestler, maybe it's as a person, maybe it's whatever. Right. So I think that is one of the things that people in general don't think about enough in wrestling. Like, it's understood. Right. It's like you and me have some mutual friends, like Kerry McCoy and Alex Clemson are the two people that come to mind, because I'm real good friends with Clemson. And I know he was your coach the last year. When I told him I was working on you, he's like, Jahi's my guy, so immediately I'm like, well, if he likes, like, you want to like each other, that kind of thing. Yeah. And you and I got thrown into a work situation together and you want to like each other. Now we actually do, but you want to find ground, for sure. So the interesting thing, I think, as somebody who's on the outside, is I went to a middle school that had like maybe 420 kids in it, like 60, middle and high school, like 60 kids to a class. And in the 7th and 8th grade, there was me, my brother, and one Black kid, and 120 kids. I had to beg my parents to go to public high school because my school didn't have wrestling. And I went to where It was hugely integrated. We actually had desegregation buses back then. So there was a ton of African Americans. And it was weird. I didn't say weird. It was I don't know why I reacted this way, but I liked it better.
Mm.
Like I liked it better. It felt more like a representation of society. Like there's some black people, there's some white people, there's some Asian people, there's some rich people, there's some poor people, there's some mean people, there's some nice people, all this sort of thing. And I got good grades. I would have got good grades in high school because I wasn't going to be allowed to wrestle if I didn't get good grades.
Right.
But I really, really appreciate that I went to an integrated experience because in
Right.
my life now, every day I talk to people of all different races. I can
Right.
tell you this, 99% of the people I talk to are not half Asian, half white. So they're all different for me.
Right. Yeah.
They're all different for me.
Right.
So how does, when a kid is making that decision on going to, and I had never heard this term either, a PWI versus an HBCU, is there any downside to sort of being at an HBCU in terms of there's not as much diversification? There's not as much interacting with people of other cultures.
So
You're not making the same connections because a lot of college and finding jobs is networking, right?
right. Right.
And I talk about networking on a monthly basis.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that?
So HBCUs are heavily connected, and just because it's a HBCU doesn't mean that it's an all Black school, right? Like Delaware State is a prime example, a very integrated school where you have all races that come into the school, right? The focus is that those are the first colleges that allow Black people to be able to go to school after
Okay.
Exactly. So they're historically Black colleges and universities. And so that in itself has history and culture because schooling was always done differently at those colleges. And so there is an integrated network, but I think to your point, right, we add wrestling there, right? You think about some of the leaders that come out of wrestling and right and being able to integrate with jobs and giving those kids opportunities to be able to go, because if you have that mutual level of respect from just wrestling, then going off to the workforce and you went to an HBCU, I think you bring a very different diverse perspective to the table by having that experience.
It's well said. And again, like I'm a big 7 Habits of Effective People, and one of the things they talk about is your lens on the world. Like you're going to look at the world differently
Right.
based on your heritage, your life experience, your age, where you grew up, everything else than I am.
Right.
And you and I have challenging conversations with each other in a very friendly way.
Right.
Like, and usually it's not even about race. It's about business. It's about an idea. It's about how to make the most money for the organization, stuff like that. But we'll hear each other out. I think we respect each other, even if we disagree, even if at the end of the day, you still think your idea is better than I do. It's like, yeah, it's cool. We're still friends. We're still friends. We're going to go forward one way or the other based on who's in charge of this specific item.
Right.
But I think the other person's perspective comes from a place of love. Like, hey, man, I'm just trying to make sure you thought of this, or I think this would be better for you. Just like a coach, you don't do every single thing a coach tells you to do. You're like, I can't do that move. That move doesn't feel right to me. Like, I'm not that guy, that kind of thing. So I think that's interesting. Let's talk about Novo a little bit, because he's a guy, I think in the wrestling world, if you're sort of tight in it, you know who he is. Former hedge fund manager, big crypto guy, obviously a super generous human being. Yep. So I've talked to you, and I know you actually you've talked to him. It's not like you kind of know who he is. Like you guys are on each other's text chain list. What kind of person for those of us that don't know Novo the way you do, what kind of guy is he?
I think he's a very caring guy and wants to really see change. Even with this project, right? Like just being able to give, HBCU Wrestling as an organization the autonomy to create an organization for, Black wrestlers, for Black schools, for HBCUs, and allowing us to make decisions and kind of go through that process and kind of use him as a resource, the expertise that he has. I think that just goes to show the character and what Novo's trying to, help us accomplish here. and be able to create these opportunities. And he really understands and values what the sport of wrestling does, always been generous for the sport of wrestling. So he thinks, that this is a really great opportunity to continue to grow our sport, but more importantly, allow a group of more Black future leaders to emerge.
So he's heavily involved with Kendall Cross and that RTC up there in New York. I get him. I think it's called the NYC RTC, not the NYRTC. I apologies if I got it wrong, but I think I got it right. And Kendall's been on the pod, and he's talked about obviously sort of reiterating what you're saying, what a good person Novo is. I'm always a person trying to get smarter. Like, one of the coolest things about doing this podcast is I get to talk to people that are really smart every week, and they kind of got to talk to me, or at least once they agreed to come on, they got to give me a little bit. Right. How much have you looked to Novo as a mentor, whether he realizes it or not? Because I'm sure he looks at the business world as somebody from a perspective of somebody who's hugely successful, both economically and in terms of influence. So, I guess I'm sure the answer is you do. Maybe can you give us an example of like some insight that he shared with you, or his perspective, or something that's made your life better?
Yeah, I think, just the generosity, but I think it's just more so just understanding that, and there's been a lot of, what I want to say is, I guess, kind of redirect. He's kind of let us do kind of like what you say, right? Like you say it often, right? Like, not being Black, right? But still understanding that you will never understand what we're going through. And he understands that. And it's really, I guess, a thing of, and I kind of want to walk you through this, and I'm thinking, because it was a really good question. And I want to give you a good answer. But it kind of shows like the respect thing in terms of us being wrestlers. And there's other people involved. Nate Parker's heavily involved. And from him, I've learned a lot, right? I've learned in terms of, and Nate Parker is really instrumental in this project. So is Kerry McCoy, just as much as Mike Novo. But we're really looking to, Nate Parker and the other members of our board. But at least from Nate, I've learned so much, right? Like, in terms of
real quick, so people know who Nate is, just for context. Nate wrestled at Old Dominion. The director, writer, producer, I don't know which one of those titles of the movie 12 Years a Slave, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So a hugely influential person, even in Hollywood. And okay, so go ahead.
Nations, yep, et cetera. Great. He played in Great Debaters. Also wrestled at Penn State as well.
Okay.
Yep. And it was All-American at Penn State. So, yep. But yeah, so just, him, just, it's been a lot of, so I guess to get back to answer your question, through this experience, I've had mentorship from a lot of different people. And so the direct influence of seeing like how Novo operates and just being able to get feedback from some of the financial models and things that we do on a day-to-day basis, that's been extremely helpful. Listening to Nate Parker speak, just the public speak. It's a Hollywood actor, right? Director. And just listening to him and just seeing, like, for him, like, he looks like me. So, and not to say that you can only learn and mentor and get mentorship from somebody that looks like you, but it definitely it empowers me to know that if he can do it, then I can possibly do it too as well. So, to say the least, there's been a lot of different mentorship. I've learned a lot from these guys indirectly just in this role. And I continue to, learn as the day goes on, as I get more in my network and I get to meet guys like you that challenge thought, invoke more conversation out of me and make me even think about my own values and why I would have certain beliefs that I have.
I am blessed that you consider me somewhat in that realm. So thank you for that. I think each of us are all trying to do, I think, what we think is the right thing, right? And if some people don't approve, then that's okay, right? Like, sometimes that just means we agree to disagree. Sometimes that means, based on the importance of the disagreement, maybe it reveals people's character a little bit, right? So you said something, and I've thought a lot about this, being involved in BWA at whatever level I am, like the idea of somebody looking like you going first, right?
Right.
I mean, I coached in junior college for a long time, and I coached a lot of African-American kids, and a lot of them were their first generation to go to college. A lot of them were the first ones to graduate with an associate's degree and then a bachelor's degree, and a lot of times higher education after that.
Yep.
You know, I grew up in a family that had two parents as school teachers. So like graduating was not like a hope, but graduating was not only you're going to do it, you're going to get great grades, or your life's going to not be very fun if you don't want to apply yourself academically. So, you know, but I think about wrestling, like my dad's favorite wrestler growing up was Tadaka Hata and Uitaki. And, you know, I never connected that. Well, everyone's Japanese in that conversation, right?
Yeah.
And then I thought about myself. My favorite wrestler growing up was Dave Schultz. And I kind of go back now and I think, why? And, you know, like I actually loved watching Kenny Monday wrestle. I loved watching Kevin Jackson wrestle, but I couldn't do what they did. Like I just couldn't, like I wasn't as explosive. And Dave Schultz looked like a guy that had like no athletic talent and just figured out a way to win, like just through skill and guile. And certainly KJ and Kenny have a ton of skill and smarts and everything else. They could just do things physically that I couldn't do.
Right.
You know, so I just was like, well, I think subconsciously I'm like, that should not be my role model because I'll never do that. Like there'll become a point where I'm like, well, this is my role model, but I can't do those 14 things.
Yeah.
And so I think now as I've gotten older, I'm like, I don't think I put enough importance on somebody looking like you, the generic you, being able to do, you know, having somebody to look up to.
Right.
I think I supported it all along as a coach.
Right.
You know, like, hey, you're the first person to graduate. You're going to set an example. A good friend of mine is a kid that he's a young man, like 30 years old, but graduated in occupational therapy and was the first one to graduate. Now his sister's going to school because of him. Like it's a cool thing to watch. Like you can break the chain, you know, but you need help. You need support. You need people to push you. So, you know, tied to like the Novo. So let's go big picture now. So now the thing is set up at Morgan State, right?
Yeah.
What year does it start? Where are they in terms of hiring a coach? What conference are they going to wrestle in? Let's just do that, the wrestling part of it first.
Yep. So they're looking to start having first season, the 23-24 season. So that'll be the first time as a varsity team. Conference affiliation, the school is still working through that to figure that out. But we're looking, the job description for the coaching role should be released fairly soon. I'll let the school kind of go and they'll go through that. But once it's posted, I'm sure there's already been a lot of support in terms of and outreach in terms of, you know, applying and excitement for the role. And so that goes to show that, like, you know, people are really excited about this, right? They want to be a part of this program. They want to make sure that it's going to be successful. And so that makes me, you know, me and the rest of the team and, you know, everyone else at HBCU Wrestling BWA really excited because we know that everyone is actively, they want to figure out ways to get involved to kind of make sure that this program and then the others that are ended up started are successful.
It's fully funded, right? 9.9 scholarships and all that kind of stuff.
Yep. So we have 9 scholarships. Coaches' salary is going to be comparable to, you know, some of the top coaches. Sure. The program is just, it's set up for success. But what is really going to really take it to the next level is making sure we get the right leader in there to kind of lead, to make sure that, you know, starting a program from scratch is tough. So someone that's hungry, someone that knows that you know what it's going to take in order for that program to be successful.
It's interesting you say that because a good friend of mine applied obviously several years back for the Fresno job. Okay. And he told me, I don't know what I believe because I don't know if they didn't pick him. So, you know, there's like, well, that girl don't want to go out with me. Here's why. Like, I don't want to go out with her anyway. Like maybe, you know, like, we've all been in that conversation. But he told me, and he ended up being right. He goes, they're only funded for 5 years. He goes, and they don't have any plans to fund it for longer than 5 years. He goes, so the person who's the coach is either going to be a full-time fundraiser or have to have an assistant coach who's a full-time fundraiser. And I think that's really critical because, the way to get more money is to have success on the mat, right?
Yeah.
Like, can you imagine if Morgan State, I remember when there was a guy from Morgan State that wrestled Ricky Stewart in the national finals, like in the early 80s. Okay.
Okay.
Because they had a headgear, really cool headgear that my dad found me one. I just remember this. Okay. So, and I didn't even know that it was a predominantly black school. I was just like, that was a cool headgear, which I guess was probably my first sign of me not being racist. Like, okay, I just want that headgear. But it's going to be so hard for a coach to start a program anyway, because you have no history. It's, like if you're recruiting to any of the top 20 schools in the country, you've had a national champion or an All-American or something. Here you got to go all the way back and you can't take credit for those people. So if you're going to have to raise money full-time on top of that, like that would almost have to be another full-time job. Right. So the fact that you guys have actually fully funded this gives the school a chance to be successful, sort of endowed it, I think is probably the right way to say it, right?
Yeah. So yeah, we got an endowment set up at Morgan State. And so they'll have money for the wrestling program and really for the wrestling program in perpetuity, if you think about how the endowment's set up. Right. And it's for wrestling and wrestling only.
Which is critical.
That's very critical that all funds going into that endowment. So, and then in terms of the coaching, we're looking at 3 coaches at Morgan State. And so as we get the head coach and be able to get the assistant and then second assistant, then hopefully a volunteer head coach. And so those are all some of the things and that we kind of considered. And even with the Fresno thing, right, I think we learned from our past failures and just in general, not us as an organization, but in terms of what happened there. And when we went in for this, with partnering with Morgan State, we took a lot of those things in consideration to figure out how can we make this deal optimal so that we don't end up in another situation like that where a program ends up failing and not having enough money to keep going. And even for us, it's a 10-year commitment at minimum on Morgan State's behalf.
Yeah. So eventually fundraising will have to happen. You'll have to consider the whole RTC thing because there's certainly expenses with an RTC, but the right kind of RTC can actually raise money. I would think there'd be a ton of integration with the Black Wrestling Association members. There's so many, that's a who's who when you're on that Zoom call. Like if you could get everybody to autograph the screen, that'd be pretty cool. I could sign it and bring the value down dramatically. But you would think that like, hey, we can bring in so-and-so as a guest clinician. You can do so-and-so as a fundraiser, these kind of things, give a speech. I feel like hopefully someone thinks of that in terms of leverage, even if they just create an RTC in terms of it existing. So then you can do things there and follow the guidelines of USA Wrestling. I hope that, I'm sure it's been thought of. I hope that gets integrated because there's some really cool one-offs you can do with that, so we've talked sort of everybody else and I don't want to skip him. You've mentioned Kerry several times, Kerry McCoy, your college coach for most of your career.
Yep.
The BWA vice president, correct?
Yep.
And obviously heavily involved with this HBCU thing. So, and clearly a mentor of yours as your college coach, right? And probably the one that recruited you or at least was involved in signing you at the very least. Yeah. So tell me about Kerry. Tell me maybe a thing or two that people don't know about Kerry.
Kerry is he's a really, me and Kerry, our relationship is very strong. Kerry's been around and he's helped me through some dark moments. He's seen me at lows. He's seen me at highs. And one thing I can say about Kerry is no matter what, he's always been a man of strong character and making sure that we just do the right thing. He's always a do the right thing type of guy. And that's really shaped me. They always say like growing up, like character isn't what you do when everyone else is looking, is what you do when no one else is around type of guy. And Kerry is, and at least for me and my experience, he's always been a guy that's always preached that and kind of really helped mentor and coach me to get to that point where I'm in my life. So I'll always be grateful for Kerry for numerous of reasons, right? Even if you look at his family structure, right? I always say this, that like Kerry was the first like Black guy that I've really seen in a position of power, being at the University of Maryland. He was the head coach of that team. And that's like, any head coaching job is like a CEO type position. You got so many different things to run, and just seeing how he interacted with his family, and just seeing that it was such the opposite picture of what is always seen on like TV and like social media of a Black family being broken or things like that. And so it's just like, for me, he's always been a good mentor, a person to model my life after, his faith. I can talk about Kerry for days about all of the good things that and quality that he's had. And even with this role, being able to just get the autonomy and being able to get his support and help them get other buy-in support from the other people on our board to believe in me, to make sure that this is executed in a way that's both, that these programs are set up for success, but is also sustainable, so that we can ultimately, create the opportunities needed. That I think it's a need, right? It's not even like a thing that might just be like an opportunity. There's a need in our sport for HBCUs to have wrestling. I think, by adding, I mean, you look at the last national championship, right? 5 of the 10 NCAA champs are Black, right? And I'm for elevating the competitiveness of our sport. So think about who else probably could have been on that level, and how many more All-Americans could have came out. That every year at NCAAs, there's someone that has an upset and does something that they're not supposed to do. And so we have more HBCUs in the sport. I think that we add, and not saying that they can't be at the top just already, but we even add more room for that, for the competitiveness.
Yeah, I wrote a couple of things down here I want to touch on based on what you said. Number one, when you mentioned the thing about characters doing something when nobody's watching, right?
Yep.
Doing the right thing. I think another example of character is doing something knowing you'll never benefit from it.
Mm.
And I remember Kerry was the coach at Stanford, and Stanford came to the Central Missouri Open, and we had a really good team that year. We had a bunch of guys who were never going to get into Stanford. Okay, like that's why they were at junior college. Like they could wrestle academically. That's why they were there. And we had a kid who's an African-American kid, and he was really good, and he lost, and he was just not going to wrestle on the back. Like he lost in the round of 16. And you know how that is. That's like 6 matches to take third kind of thing, And I've always argued it's harder to take third than second, because the whole time you're taking third, you can't take first. The whole time you take second, you could win until it's over, know? So, he wasn't going to wrestle. And I asked Kerry, I barely knew him. I said, would you talk to him, please? He goes, what do you want me to say to him? I'm like, anything that'll convince him to wrestle. And, I explained, I go, he's not hurt. He just don't want to wrestle because he can't win the tournament. I have no idea what Kerry said to him. The kid came back and won 6 matches and took third. Wow. And he's really good. Like, he's like one of those guys you just hand his sweats to, and you roll him out there and he does well. But I remember talking to Kerry when we were leaving, and I just said, I don't know what you said. None of my business. I respect the fact, that kid will never come to your school, and you took 5 minutes to help him. And so that's I've interacted with Kerry a lot, since then, especially last year when we were putting the gala together. But in a moment where he's got kids wrestling all over the place, he took 5 minutes to help a kid and probably change the season. Because if he doesn't wrestle, now it's a big thing. You know how that goes. You're a coach, you're like, man, now I got to make an example of this guy, and it just creates a bunch of strife. And instead, that guy proved himself he could do it. So,
I mean, even for me, like for Kerry, I walked on to the University of Maryland wrestling team. And so it's just like even taking the chance and opportunity for me to join the team, right? And then I ended up having some success at Maryland, right? But I mean, he's always had that type of, attitude. So that story really doesn't surprise me at all.
I don't think it surprises anybody who knows Kerry. I think it's just fair to maybe the people that only know of Kerry to get an example. You're obviously his guy. Literally, you wrestled for him, but somebody that I wouldn't say we're peers, but close age-wise we're peers. And, we never collaborated on anything together until the gala last year. an
Yep.
example where he had nothing to gain and everything to lose, not everything to lose, but waste his time. And he did that. So
Yeah.
something else you mentioned 5 of the 10 national champs were African-American. Obviously Gable was an Olympic champion. I think the goal, and I'm just saying this out loud, is that one day we don't have to count it that way, right? That
Right.
it's just so integrated. It's like, I remember like when they asked Doug Williams what it felt like to be the first Black quarterback to be in the Super Bowl. It's like, well, I don't know, because I've been Black my whole life, that maybe like questions like that aren't even thought of anymore. And that's
Right.
probably the real sign of it. I was watching this Muhammad Ali special yesterday, just flipped it on during lunch, and it looked at the difference, just what the vernacular, just what was in the lexicon of how people talked about African Americans and to African Americans. And I don't by any means want to say like, hey, it's 2022 and everything's cool now, right? Because it's not. But it's greatly improved, right? It's greatly improved from the 60s, which were terrible. If you're a person that just wants to make things better, but you're a normal person, you don't have a truckload of money, you don't have a truckload of free time, and you're not African American, what would be a suggestion, maybe a small thing that a person could integrate into their life, their lifestyle, how they communicate, that can have an impact? What is something that's a doable task that would make a difference, you think?
I think it starts with education, and just becoming more educated on topics, different things. And it doesn't have to be, right. And that could be a 5-10 minute task, just educating yourself on, just the history, civil rights movement, kind of some of the things that took place there, or even kind of even dating back even far further. I think it starts with education, because if you're educated and you know what has gone on, then you can kind of start to begin to take preventive measures, so that things like that has taken place doesn't continue to take place. And so I think just an overall understanding of that, and having the want, right, and to actually learn things that went, and having an open mind, and kind of like the thing where it's like we can agree to disagree on certain topics, but at least being open-minded enough, to be able to take that, is important.
So the education one I think is important. I think some people may say, well, look, I can go study the Civil War, I can go study, the slave ships and everything else. I don't know if that helps me, except know that was super messed up. I will tell you what I did when we were going to do the Black Wrestling Association Gala tied to Juneteenth, tied to the massacre in Tulsa.
Right.
I knew very little about it. I think it was like sort of like the Japanese intern camps to me. Like you don't read about it. They're not in school. It's not a super proud moment in American history, you know? And so I read and I studied it. And I think even if I didn't like learn anything except to know, okay, this is what happened and that was terrible. Like there was like, and I don't know the names, but there was people that would have become like the Hiltons of today, African,
Mhm.
and that wiped out generations of family wealth and
Right.
generations of people that they were philanthropic could have done which probably they were, could have done dramatically positive things for that group of people, made a difference. I
Right.
think what I learned from it is to maybe not speak so quickly,
Mm.
like maybe just like sometimes somebody comes across as maybe strong, maybe almost militant, but if you don't know everything on why they feel that way, instead of
Mm.
saying like, hey man, tamp it down, just go, what do you know that I don't know?
Right.
Because to me, like I don't know if you knew about the World War II intern camps, but if you didn't, and I'm like, well, this, like my dad's actually a really super nice guy. He found a blessing in it, which is amazing. But if he
Right.
was upset about it, he'd actually have a right to be in my mind, you
Right.
know? But if you said, why is your dad angry? Or like, hey man, your dad's kind of a jerk, instead of saying, why is your dad angry? Right.
Right.
Like those are, I think, starting dialogues. Like you and
Right.
me fall into these dialogues just regularly, like about stuff. Cause I'll ask you, I'm like, what am I missing here? Why am I seeing this? What is going on? You know, like you and I talked about the Ahmaud Arbery situation,
Right.
you know, just,
Yeah.
and I hopefully when I come to you, it's out of you're like, this person wants to understand. They're trying to make themselves better. They're not trying to tell me how I should feel. They're trying to understand. They're trying to form their own opinions and get
Right.
multiple pieces of input on it. So
Right.
I,
Right.
I certainly see the education part as being a huge piece of it. So let's kind of close with BWA. We just had this conference call on Sunday. There's some things, you know, obviously percolating. If somebody wanted to support BWA, obviously they can just go to Black Wrestling Association. Is it .com or .org?
.com.
.com.
Yeah.
There's a donate now button. We heard that several times on the call. So maybe this call will help generate some leverage there. What if a person wants to donate? How can they expect that money to be utilized?
For
So what is
the
BWA going to do? Like if I don't, what's BWA going to do with my $100? I think somebody
right.
might ask that.
So the mission for BWA is kind of broad. So to inspire, connect, and empower. So we're working on a variety of different initiatives. One of our initiatives is the Annual Gala that'll take place to kind of highlight some of the events that took place the prior year, and just overall, just give those inside of our sport their flowers while they're here, and making sure that we're awarding different awards year over year. We're also having an approach for legacy clinics. So being able to go back to community and connect directly and work with the kids, kind of have that face value, that one-on-one time. And so that's another big pillar. We also have a few other initiatives regarding outreach and things like that. But that'll all kind of be, formalized and put into a plan together. We're in the process of hiring our executive director. So I'm sure you're well aware of it.
But not everyone else is, right? Not everybody else. Sure.
Yeah, exactly. So so once the executive director's role is filled, we'll have more of a direction of where we're going to take, where we're going to go. And so right now, all the funds, a majority of the funds are being utilized to kind of help fund that role so that we continue to keep the operations and day-to-day going for BWA.
I think it's important to directly state that one of the tasks or roles of that person is to create events or do things to generate more revenue than what they're being paid. So I think that's important if people understand that. Like, well, I just don't want to donate to fund some person's salary to do whatever they want to do.
Right.
Like, I think people people, that's important. Like, I don't mind giving money. I want to know where it's going to go. So one of the things that we talked about on the call, which I think people should understand is formulating. I think BWA is already doing it, but maybe not doing the best job of communicating it, is saying this much money will lead to this. This much money will lead to this. Like BTS Chicago, Mike Powell over there does a great job. He's like, well, look, this much money will pay for a kid's food for the weekend. This one will pay for their hotel or housing for the weekend. This one will pay for their entry fee. This one will pay for their uniform, their shoes and singlet and warm-ups for the whole year. I think BWA is going to do a better job of communicating that to people because that's tangible, right? Like if you said, hey, man, I just graduated, which you did, and congratulations, by the way. Sorry you didn't get to give your induction speech. COVID got you twice.
Yeah.
or not induction speech, your graduation speech. You were chosen for that, so congratulations. But if you said, hey, David, I'm X amount of dollars short of graduating. I can't take out a loan. But if I do this, then I can take this job over with HBCUs or BWA, and I can now make these calls and generate, I'm just pulling a random number out of the air, like $250,000 a year. So if somebody could help me with this smaller amount, well, I don't mean to undersell or oversell.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is people can see ROI. Like if I can help fund this, I'll pick a number that works mathematically. If we can get Jahi 2,500, he can go generate 250,000. Well, that's 100x on your money, right?
Exactly.
So you can feel really good about it.
Exactly.
So,
and then I think even to your point further, it's just to be able to have those types of things communicated out. And I think that's exactly what we're doing with the executive director role, is so that we can make sure those communications are going out so things are kind of more clear and I guess dry for people.
For sure. I knew this 45 minutes would fly. It did. We're out of time. Congratulations on everything, man. Keep doing good work. I know you and I will continue to communicate about the stuff you're doing and about the gala, blackwrestlingassociation.com. And if they want to learn more about HBCUs, is it HBCU Wrestling or what?
HBCUWrestling.org.
.org.
Or feel free to reach out to me directly, LinkedIn, Instagram. I'm all Jahi Jones. Or if you want to shoot me email, it's jahi@hbcwrestling.org.
You're the first person to put your email on the pod. Well done. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching, listening. We'll talk to y'all next week.